This was a big week. Last Sunday was Portuguese 4th of July. This Sunday is the day in which, 6 years after Portuguese 4th of July, the restorer of Portuguese independence, King John IV, put his crown in the image of Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception in 1646, for supposedly having interceded in recovering Portuguese independence from Spain, so declaring the Lady of the Conception Queen of Portugal. From then onwards, no king or queen used the crown on their heads, except on their coronation, since it was declared that only the Virgin herself could use it in Portugal. In the same day, the Portuguese were celebrating their holiday. The former Prime Minister and now President of the European Council, in his speech, compared his own country's fight for independence with the situation in the Ukraine, at Kiev. All this made me think about the situation of being a lesser country. Lesser in the sense that there are countries that normally, for being small in territory, or even if they aren't so small in territory, are made smaller being fought either an even larger neighbor, or a stronger major power, or even a larger but stronger neighbor. The Democratic Republic of the Congo being often invaded or destabilized by its smaller but socioeconomically stronger neighbor, Rwanda. I have always been on the Ukraine side in this situation, not because I think that it is flawless, or because I don't think that there aren't people trying to exploit the conflict economically, but because as someone from a smaller country that had to fight to keep its freedom from a neighbor that considers itself a more natural state, and which often considers that the lesser independent neighbor is just the extent of their culture and their people or peoples, I just can't avoid seeing myself in the Ukraine. And seeing our Spanish neighbors were often to us in our past history in how Russia is being today. Now, it's interesting that at the first glance, people say that the conflict in the Ukraine shows a schism between the West and the rest, or people criticizing that it's a white people cause that only white people care about. But when you start looking under the surface and away from just the action of governments, Nigeria, for example, has long followed a non-aligned foreign policy with a tendency to try to get along with every side. But recently, its influence in West Africa suffered a blow by the Russian support to the anti-Nigerian foreign policy followed by the post-coup government of Niger, which founded a new rival West African organization, the Alliance of Sahel States. Likewise, despite pro-Russia internet trolls being concerned with Sudan and that people only care about the Ukraine, the truth is Sudan is passing its current civil war because of Russia supporting rebels within its politics and army against the post-coup democratic transition government. And that government from Sudan has actually been sending arms to the Ukraine because they see it as a way to defend themselves indirectly from Russian destabilization. So it's way more to this than just everyone from southern countries being with Russia and only former colonial empires or the current American empire being for the Ukraine. If anything, most countries in the south kept some sort of neutral stance, trying to say they just want peace and have been negotiating with both sides to some extent. Just notice all the small island nations of Oceania, together with their more major westernized neighbors like Australia and New Zealand, voted as a whole bloc supporting the resolution condemning the first actual military Russian invasion in 2022. Nearly every Pacific island state voting in favor. In the debate preceding the vote, Fijian Ambassador Chandra Prasad, not representing his country but the whole of the Pacific Islands Forum, openly called for, and I quote, the withdrawal of Russian armed forces and an end to aggression, which violates the UN Charter, and that the world needs its diplomats and all its leaders to address climate change and can only do so once peace is restored in Ukraine. Maldives ambassador to the UN, Thilmisa Hussain, also took a stance against the Russian action, saying that as a small state, the Maldives has always taken a principled stand on violation of the territorial integrity of a sovereign nation, also calling on the principles of the UN Charter to defend this. Despite all this talk of left and right, whites and non-whites, of what is a Western and a non-Western country, the truth is, at the end of the day, the United States, Russia, China, India, and regional powers like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, South Africa, Brazil, Australia, have way more in common with each other, despite being often on opposite sides, because they understand the same reasoning. A major territorial unit in an area being the major player there, or even in the world, that their power is to be used, that it's great to be great. The needs of their lesser neighbors have to be fitted into their own interests, and that they are more natural and reasonable states that, if possible, could even assimilate or at least have a very controlling relationship over a given neighbor, or even that can solve their problems for them. Some people might argue that this is geographical determinism, but to that I'll recall what a philosophy teacher of mine said in high school, that people often confuse fate and chance as the same thing, when actually, if there is such a thing as chance, then there can't be fate, and vice versa, because if everything is pre-written, then there is no luck, and if there is luck, then how much is actually written? So this is the thing. Unlike some who think that any comment that geographical conditions can affect the human society in it and say that it's fatalism. In fact, we're just talking the fact that there is chance that things happen and they have side effects and byproducts. So it's obvious that geography does influence how a general majority view of a society comes to be. It has often been commented that the human societal equivalent of the biological evolutionary island dwarfism, gigantism, is a very specific psychology of people who live in islands, especially small ones. It might lead to a certain feeling that you are trapped in a certain place, while simultaneously the often cruel element that traps you is also what can free you to travel the world outside it, by contrast with continental people who can always go elsewhere, going onwards and onwards throughout the continent their country is in. But continental countries too can have differences in view in how a landlocked country and a country with a shoreline view things, again being or not against a surrounding element which can be seen as both a gateway into the world and a cruel, destructive thing. In the same way, clearly being from a larger country instead of a micro, small, medium, or even medium-large state, or at least having some neighbors of different strength that can put us in our place, has effects on the society we'll view things. There's something to be said of a country having wide spaces can lead to a whole different psychology in the society of the country and the people dwelling within it. Even though it might be unpopular to recognize it, a lot of, say, Sri Lankans are starting to look at Ukraine and thinking the Ukraine is them and Russia is India. Bangladesh is looking at the Ukraine and thinking it is them and that Russia is India or Pakistan. People in South Sudan seeing the other Sudan in Russia. Or people in the Sudan looking at Russia's involvement in their own problems and seeing themselves in the Ukraine. People in Yemen seeing themselves in the Ukraine and Saudi Arabia in Russia. Taiwan in relation to China, Nigeria to Nigeria, the Guianas seeing themselves in the Ukraine and Venezuela in Russia, etc. We have both larger and smaller countries who have supported the Ukraine, and both larger and smaller countries have supported Russia, and larger and smaller countries who are neutral. But we do see that when we get away from how the countries actually vote, and we look at the people inhabiting the states, we see that often, despite profits that can be had in the US with the war, and despite the idea that the US are really behind it, most US Americans are way too worried with the possibility of US Americans dying in the war, and with the costs of the war, that they are spending their own money at some other. And that goes for a lot of larger, or at least more powerful countries, like France often basically is telling the Ukraine to take the gains it already had and race to negotiations with Russia so as to permit Russia to have a more or less dignified defeat, or something dignified they wouldn't be called a defeat. At the end of the day, the larger countries have more in common, regardless of what official line. Of course, we have countries that are still used to seeing themselves as large, imperial, while simultaneously dealing with the fact that they really aren't anymore, and being somewhat aware. In Europe, we see all sorts of countries of all sorts of sizes, but also large that were colonial, large that weren't colonial. Smaller countries that were colonial but were treated as inferior by other colonial countries who had their immigrants going to wealthier European countries. And we even have European countries who were treated as colonies by other European countries, including historically the Ukraine. Due to this, a lot of southern countries who had a pro-Russian history and a history of seeing Russia as the good guys and their friends now are getting very schizophrenically confused and nervous about about the fact that they like Russia and they see Russia as the heir of a Soviet Union that might have been their friend, but simultaneously they will look at how the Ukraine is being treated by Russia and be very nervous thinking of their own bigger or stronger neighbors. And some have even already started to have the Russians as their opponents, or at least opponents of their people while supporting their government, as we see, for example, with the recent military and defense dealings of the São Tomé and Príncipe government, basically privatizing the local armed forces under the Russian Wagner Group. And I hope this isn't taken as hatred against larger countries. The point is that you will always think a certain way and you have to do your thing and we'll have to do ours. And we'll have to agree to disagree and maybe put our situations above other more temporary and ideological alliances and tell each other you wouldn't get it. António de Sousa Macedo, Portuguese diplomat, writer and journalist, wrote in his Lusitania liberata ad injusto castellanorum dominio, restituta legittimo principi serenissimo Joanni IV, which more or less means Lusitania freed from the unjust Castilian or Spanish dominion, restored by the legitimate prince, the most serene John IV. Included an illustration in the cover which represented the dragon, a common symbol in Portuguese royal shields, dominating a Castilian lion who is revealed to actually have lamb's hind feet. Over it, in Latin, there was the inscription Unc Leo Fisus credit tenuis Draconem, sed quia justus eum iam Draco fecit ovem. Hoc docet exemplum breviter violenta perire, solace in aeternum vivere justa solent. Or, by the nail, thought so the lion have grabbed the dragon, but because it is just, already the dragon made a sheep out of it. This teaches the example that rapidly usually die violently, only the just usually live for eternity. So I just can't avoid to expect that, like the dragon did to the lion, that the Ruthenian lion will show the bear to be just a sheep, or the Taiwanese bear to the dragon, the Sinhala rooster to the tiger, Swazi and Malawian Thompson gazelle outsmarting the South African springbok antelope, or the Guianese little jaguar, or the Surinamese lesser kiskadee outwitting the Venezuelan white warhorse of Bolivar, the Guatemala being dominated by the Mexican golden eagle, etc.